Hi, this is Lesiba Mabitsela, and this is me and my studio on TAF Open Access. My practice is pretty much in this very gray area between design and art. It is believed in the industries that artists don't make money. So I decided, let me use my creative skills in a space that can actually bring me some sort of income. Then I went and did art at Tshwane University of Technology. I think that exposed me to different ways of being a creative. And in many ways, we were talking interdisciplinary. I became an interdisciplinary artist at Tshwane University of Technology. I got my first job in Brooklyn, which was wedding dresses and matric dance dresses. And so there was a lot of emphasis on technique in those sorts of spaces. The idea of, focusing not only on what clothes can kind of portray you as, but the techniques, the skills, the histories that go into how clothes are made. And how clothes are made has become a very important part of my practice today. 8.5 years that I was based in Cape Town, and being there kind of saw me work for designers such as Gavin Raja. Towards the end of my tenure there, I started to flirt around with the art industry. And that was due to Khanyisile Mbongwe. And she saw some of these blanket sculptures that I was busy with. Soon enough, I got into an exhibition. From there, then it was the Samsung Inspired Design Award that got me to also get some attention for a residency called Open Lab 2014, which was in Bloemfontein, and I met Jay Partha there. It was a collective of so many other artists who are prominent today, the likes of Stembile Msizwana, the likes of Francois Knutza, the likes of Sandile Khadebe, the likes of Pumladi Ntuli, Gavin Creston I also met there. And so it almost felt like I was going back to that space where you have multi sort of disciplines within one space, and we're all learning from each other. And I think it also opened my mind up to this idea of not just clothing as the stagnant sort of object, but it gaining meaning through movement, performance, and site-specific sort of interventions. It was a really nice class of artists. At the same time, it was my first residency. I mean, I think that was a big thing for any creative, especially in that time. It was like, all right, I'm going to do something within the arts. And I needed to get a residency because that's what all my art friends were kind of talking about. Get yourself into a residency. Open Lab was conducted in collaboration with the Kunstefees and UFS, so University of the Free State. Our head facilitator at the time was Paul Kadzola, and he is an experimental artist based in Australia. But yeah, the politics of the space speaks for itself. It's Bloemfontein. There was the infamous pissing sort of saga and the cleaners and all that type of stuff. And so I guess it was good that they opened themselves up to that, but also opened themselves up to the critique of such a historical space due to the our background or historical background within the country. I think what was really important to reiterate was that we're talking about site specific, and we're talking about going to a space that I'm not used to, which is Bloemfontein, and so you're engaging with politics of the space, and that's something that I hadn't necessarily considered as a fashion designer for a long time. I maybe flirted with it when I started with the blanket sculptures. In Richmond was where we learned quite a little bit more. We were based at the Modern Arts Project, the space for artists to come and visit. And you also got to be exposed to this town of Richmond. It kind of was the first time I saw the arts having a role to play in the economics of the space. And I think people don't understand how arts can actually be an economic driver for small towns like that. But you're also responding to the issues of apartheid, the legacy of apartheid in a space that is disconnected from cosmopolitan areas or big cities, right? And seeing how those issues of politics have affected lives in those areas. There was a lot of unemployment when I went there. but also we settled in a very nice posh white area, or the white section of the city or the town. There's roads, there's houses. You still had segregation based on colors. You had colored people in other areas, you had black people in other areas as well. I think was important for not only myself but many of the other artists on the program as well, because then they started to understand their own biases when creating site-specific performances, because then we started to learn you can't just take things and make artworks out of it. It's very strong politics within this space. So in 2014 I went as a participant, and then in 2016 I went as a facilitator. I still had issues of, imposter syndrome back then, because it was like, well, you're still a designer or you're artist now. Getting into that sort of space. And I think they saw large potential in what I was doing as an artist. And so they invited me back. And it was really great to kind of bring in new students into that space. There was another crew of prominent artists who also joined the second term, and for me the process was just to show them how to develop these ideas of perceptions. I kind of got that idea from my first visit, largely the white spaces, the people who are settling there kind of retiring or something like that, but the other parts of the community looked ready to work, and you could see that based on the fact that they were wearing overalls and so forth. I was really much into this sort of silhouette area. And so I was trying to show people the ways in terms of looking at society, and not necessarily only about buildings and landscape and so on, but in the clothes that we wear, and how those could be simplified down to basic shapes, and how we attach shapes to then stories. I think it was a really interesting, fruitful sort of process, not only for them but for myself as now a teacher, and also someone who's translating how they see clothing. Why are we not creating our own websites? Things like that was like, I couldn't quite get it, because you look overseas and everybody's got their own website. The website tells a story about who you are and what you are about. As the first point of entry for most people who are just trying to find out, oh, I know this name, I don't know anything about them, let me see. And then I started to learn that it's because there's these sort of the ideas of stables based on what gallery you belong to, and the gallery becomes some sort of directory to all the artists. And that kind of, it kind of didn't make sense for me as a person who was very invested in this idea of business within the arts as well. As a designer, I'm very able to separate myself from the person who's pushing a brand, but also the artist. I think the one that really troubled me was this idea that you have Marina Abramovich, who is in this gallery, and the garment was as much a part of the artwork as her being there, and the design was never acknowledged in that sort of performance. And I was like, we know in the industry that there's a specific garment that looks like that. I'm thinking Alexander McQueen, turned out to be Ricardo Tisci. They are also fully invested in the creation of that work, of the garment, because when you are asked to do something custom, we don't just say, okay, you want a red dress. We take in what the purpose of this work is about, and we facilitate our own creative sort of energy within how it becomes reality. So I've been seeing a lot of this sort of movement happening in areas like the Netherlands. They're kind of pushing this fashion and performance work and interdisciplinary work a lot more than many spaces, but there are a lot of people who are interested in Belgium, and that comes through their flavor of fashion. And I guess that's the thing within South Africa. The flavor of fashion, the way we understand fashion, is very much this superficial, high society type of industry. Whereas you get to spaces like Belgium, you got people like Martin Magella and the Antwerp Six, who kind of put fashion to that space where you could seriously be considered as artworks. Also, there's a very strong academic sort of wing coming out of spaces like the Netherlands and Belgium. And so it's certainly very important that South Africa has that edge, especially in Johannesburg. I think more so than Cape Town. You need grit for that, and I think Johannesburg has that. You know, it has a lot of that. The fashion industry is pretty large here as well, and I'd say the fashion industry that's more focused on avant-garde than just your daily things I can wear at the beach. So more than the t-shirts, more than the pants, more than the bucket hats. It's like, it's large over here in terms of custom wear and custom design. And we've been doing this sort of collaboration for many years. Stephen Cohen has been getting some items done with Clive Rundle, for instance, and Strange Love. So they've collaborated on many accounts in terms of making garments for performance artists. So I think it's been there, it just needed acknowledgement. And in this point where I am at, I think every time I try and do that, I try and put that sort of acknowledgement that I am a fashion designer, but I'm also an artist. I can step into the performance space, but I can also separate myself from that as well and just be someone who is conceptualizing the works, which I have done a lot of, because it's, you know, performance work is also very taxing on your self-identity. It's also your insecurities that come into that sort of space, because it's like, I think when I did go to UCT, I did my degree at UCT. So but it was in theatre and performance, my master's degree, but it required me to now engage in a part of me that was always there, but I've kind of denied this performative self. And so that was my first experiences of performing as myself, or besides, you know, this routine of fashion designer where we get models to come and step into our clothes. Now it's like I'm designing to do that for myself. And I think that's when I started to think fully of myself as an artist, because I'm putting myself head front, as, you know, within my work as well, which we don't do quite a lot of. So yeah, I think that's how I think about it, and I think that's where we're going, and I hope that's where we're going. And I think that's what I want to try and bring into Johannesburg space, which kind of initially was the thoughts when I did come back, was that, you know, how can I interact with this Joburg scene on an artistic level, but also targeting that sort of avant-garde fashion sort of crowd as well, who are so part of the fabric of the city. I guess I was going through the whole process of finding home, momentarily homeless for some, you know, 1-2 occasions where we didn't agree with the landlord and we had to sleep at some sort of backpackers in Long Street. I mean, how we suffered in those small moments is not enough compared to how many people suffer within Cape Town itself. And you can see it in the cities. Forget about what's outside. You see it in the cities, and then you can go to see what's outside, which is even worse. This is the initial idea of where I started with the blankets. We always kind of see fashion within the spaces of the rich and famous. But, you know, a level of humanity can be also be given in this idea or this understanding that, you know, even with something as simple as a blanket, there is elements of feeling of aesthetic joy. My idea was thinking around, what if there is some sort of inherent style within, you know, communities that of people who are homeless. Within your moment of suffering can also find bits of joy. How we suffered in those small moments is not enough compared to how many people suffer within Cape Town itself. And you can see it in the cities. Forget about what's outside. You see it in the cities, and then you can go to see what's outside, which is even worse. So I think I saw that, and it was reflected back at me, and this is the initial idea of where I started with the blankets. The idea of, you know, we always kind of see fashion within the spaces of the rich and famous. A level of humanity can be also be given in this idea or this understanding that, you know, even with something as simple as a blanket, there is elements of feeling of aesthetic joy. My idea was thinking around, what if, you know, there is some sort of inherent style within, you know, communities that of people who are homeless, and not just seeing them as homeless people object. Within your moment of suffering can also find bits of joy. And that's when I started playing around with folds. And so it's kind of been reflected here. And weirdly enough, it's been reflected throughout my whole career, because I'm looking at how my last performance was in Cape Town, which is Vetting Men. And Vetting Men, I was kind of looking at masculinities, because I was going through the process of, you know, understanding myself as a young man, but also understanding my father, who's now got Alzheimer's, but he was showing early signs of Alzheimer's, and so his teachings started to come up a lot in my work. You know, going through the processes of what suits me into society, and again, I latched onto a blanket used to mark rites of passage and initiation processes, and turned those into suits. So this idea of performative, the idea of fashion, the idea of how we can change ourselves and the perceptions that those garments carry, such as the suit, was really important for me. With Vetting Men, for instance, it was a spoof of Vetman, which had been in fashion at the time it came into prominence. And that was like, it's translated into clothes. It's like French for clothes. But, you know, adding the ting in the middle kind of introduced you into the process of being a high school student. And I played on, you know, a part of my life where I was really involved with rugby and sports. And I wanted all the colors so that I could get my white blazer. It's funny because through that process, you know, I created this character. So it was a character that was loosely based on Jesus Christ. But he ended up looking like someone who was homeless. The whole way, it was unintended. It's something that has carried me throughout my career. So this topic of homelessness is very strong, and it has come through here as well, because now I've relocated back home. I think the pandemic was important because firstly, I started to see individuals recycling our rubbish on Fridays, and they would come and collect. But there was a particular silhouette that I was really interested in, which is the trash bag silhouette, and they were carrying that around. And I think there was also the Me Too movement, which kind of coincided with this idea of men being trash. And there's literally men walking around with trash bags in the streets. And so I'm trying to have that conversation. And so again, it's like I managed to find the throwaways of a society wherever I am, right? And I think I've linked a lot of my work to this Christian sort of upbringing. So my father was heavily into Christianity, and I was also a altar server. So a lot of the work that I do within practice over here has a lot of references to the Bible, references to biblical stories. And on coming back, I kind of looked at issues of the prodigal son, the idea that you've left home for a better life. But I was really interested in how young men, it's almost like the initiation process. You leave home, one, to become a man, but also to kind of create a better life for yourself than the one that you came from, which is really much the story of homeless people in Cape Town, is that they leave their homes because sometimes it's just, you know, better to be in the city than it is to be in, you know, the hoods or the flats. There's a lot of people who can't go home like I can, you know, and so how do we make vivid that struggle, especially in this climate? You kind of get all these insecurities about the idea of failure, and the idea of failure as a masculine individual is what looms largest in our lives. Is, did you make a success of yourself wherever you went out to go and catch? Did you bring back the bacon, in other words? And, you know, in some ways, I felt like I did, but also in other ways, I didn't feel like I did. And in some ways, I think that it's the most important part for men, which is the financial element of it. So I think that kind of also goes into that, but it also goes into this idea of how we are, as men, are packaged. And so I was looking at many of the packaging items. That's why I'm making like vests in like bubble wrap, and, you know, looking at the packaging of clothes that we receive that kind of define our masculinities. So something like because I was at home, I'm looking at the internal elements of myself and how that vest has kind of gained prominence as this item used to package or to kind of identify a form of masculinity that's very violent. Obviously, it has its roots in America. Marlon Brando starred in a movie where this vest became the symbol of violence. But also, you kind of look at it to Italian immigrants, but also even back home, you look at Zulu taxi drivers or Zulu men with that sort of leopard vest, and those were kind of coming into relation. So this idea of packaging was very important. I had this idea to kind of work on, Louis Vuitton, Burberry as forms of packaging, but within there's packaging in itself. And so it also kind of ties back to the whole prodigal son story. It's a very open process. It's never like, okay, I'm going to go and do this because I want to get this out of this. It's a story that keeps on developing. And I would even say it started in Cape Town because I wanted to do stuff on paper. And so I was starting to work on embroidery kind of works. But it's interesting how that embroidery has come now to be a sort of a technique that I can use to embellish or onto artworks, and maybe also it speaks to some sort of truth in the work that I'm kind of doing. It's a lot of trial and error, and sometimes it's just putting as much as you can and then stripping it away, or putting as much as you can, letting someone else strip it away. The virtual fellowship with the ICA, which is the Institute for Creative Arts. What came out of that process was me now collaboratively working with, some new people, but some of the old people, but also not necessarily being physically part of the process, being the brains at this point. And a large part of that was Zoom calls. A large part of the interviews I conducted was Zoom calls. And it kind of just reflected where we were at in the society right now. Is that we're talking about a site-specific sort of issue, as in Rex true form, but at the same time, we are conducting it on the digital space. How do we take that process? How do I share that process? I wanted to use process as an aesthetic tool. And so looking at storyboards or things that we do as artists and creatives, I thought that was a really interesting aesthetic lens to kind of put into the digital as a storyboard, as opposed to it just being a performance. It was just more a series of activations that were arranged, and you allow the person to conduct their own story, but the storyboard is talking to you. There isn't a final product that the storyboard contributed towards, which never necessarily gets shared. That could not have happened had I been allowed to be in Cape Town, had I not moved back home, had we not had the pandemic. I don't even think Zoom would have been a thing. It would have been as usual, carry on as usual. And so that's the beauty of this time. Even though there's a lot of struggle, but yeah, there was a lot of ingenuity, I guess, in it too.